Hello, Starseeds, and welcome to this episode of Astrology Chats. It took me a long time to get set up, and I wanted to do this particular presentation dressed as Samus, the first lady of video games, because of the nature of the presentation today. We are going to be learning all about your rising sign, also known as your Ascendant. And typically, this is why astrologers would ask you for your birth time. So I'm not going to spend too much time in the introduction. I tried to put together a little bit of a transition scene, let's say, to transition into Miss Samus. But your ascendant sign is all about how your chart and its housing system actually ends up lining up. So without further ado, let's get into the next episode of Astrology Chats, all about your rising sign. Okay, Starseeds, welcome to the presentation all about your rising sign. And the little tagline at the bottom is, why is your birth time so important? This will hopefully answer all of those questions. So let's get into it. And as you can see, the nature of this 8-bit presentation, I am dressed as Samus, the first lady of video games, in reference to us actually learning about this game of life, this incarnation, this game that we're playing right now, because astrology is such a great way for you to get intel on, just the way that we came into this existence gives you some intel as to how you can play the game at the highest level that you can. And your rising sign is for sure part of that. So as per usual in my presentations, I have a little bit of an agenda just as a way to keep our ideas and our thoughts and our conversation grounded, and so we don't go off on a tangent, which is what I am so likely to do. And there's nothing wrong with that in the context of conversation and events, but in the context of this presentation, we're trying to learn all about your rising sign and your ascendant or your ascendant. Let's get into what the actual agenda is and the breakdown of topics as they're covered today. So we're starting with, of course, what is your rising sign? What is it? What is the significance of the rising sign in your birth chart and astrologically, and what this has to do with perhaps other people's birth charts, and does it have a major role in things like synastry or love astrology? And finally, we're going to get into the meanings behind your rising sign. Now, if you tune into any of my Astro Chat lives where I do any tarot card readings, typically some astrologers will subscribe to the fact that your rising sign is actually your more important sign, but I look at it as it's more of a trifecta. And so depending on you, you may want to look at readings for your sun, your rising, and your moon signs when it comes to things like that. What is your rising sign? Big question. The whole question of this presentation, really. Your rising sign, or ascendant, is the zodiac sign that was ascending the eastern horizon at the time you were born. And it sets up your entire birth chart. It's exactly why astrologers will ask you about your exact birth time. It's simply because your rising sign actually can change every 2 hours, on the minute, really. So if you think about all of these houses and where they line up with the signs, that is all dictated by your rising sign. Now I'm going to get into the meanings behind your rising sign. When I did the Astrological Starseed Blueprint on Freddie Mercury from Queen, there was a saying that Brian May said that Freddie named himself Freddie Mercury because Mercury was the ruling planet of his rising sign. Now, off the top of my head, I can't remember what Freddie Mercury's rising sign is, but he was a Virgo, so it was actually his sun sign that was ruled by Mercury. In terms of rising signs that are notable, both Johnny Depp and Marilyn Monroe, who I both did their charts, you can check that out on my channel, they're both Leo risings, even though they're both Geminis. And you can see how that can explain perhaps why some Geminis express themselves in certain ways and some Geminis will express themselves in other ways. Or to put this more specifically to you, you may feel like sometimes you don't necessarily subscribe to or feel like your sun sign. And your rising sign and your moon sign as well are perhaps the reasons why that could be. You may find more allegiance or find that you feel more deeply as your rising sign or your ascendant sign. There are actually some astrologers that subscribe to or believe in the fact that your rising or ascendant sign, so your birth time and that first house, that really is the most important part of your birth chart, even more important than your sun sign or your solar sign. Okay, so now I'm going to delve a little bit more deeply into the meanings behind your rising or ascendant sign. So firstly, it is why your birth time is so important. I know that I've hammered that into your guys' heads over the last couple slides, but even if you don't know your exact birth time, even knowing, let's say, whether or not you were born early in the morning or in the afternoon or sometime in the middle of the night, can give you a little bit more intel or clues behind what that rising sign could be, because some astrologers can do a little bit of a guess, which I've done in the past in some of my readings. So your rising sign is a zodiac sign that was ascending the eastern horizon at the time you were born. There's also this metaphor of a book. And so if you are a book and you're a story and you're living out your life as this story, then the ascendant is the book cover and the introduction, or let's say that intro synopsis as to why you would want to read a book. And I've read that in, love astrology, when people think of rising signs, it's kind of like that first impression of someone. When you first meet someone, you're more likely to consider them as what their rising sign is. And then the more you get to know them, perhaps the more revealing of what their solar and moon sign, if you're lucky, will become revealed to you in that relationship. And so finally, in relation to your sun sign, which is your main horoscope, or what is popularly known as your horoscope sign. So I'm a Taurus, my sun sign is a Taurus. I am an Aries rising. Now, in relation to the sun sign refers to the inner eye, whereas the ascendant or the rising sign refers to the outer eye. And so, as I was saying about first impressions or the cover of a book, it's about that first impression and the outer eye as to how others perceive you. So as it comes to your main star signals in your birth chart, you can see that your ascendant and your rising sign is kind of that first pillar, and then you have your sun or solar sign followed by your moon sign, which is your emotional sign. Now, what you'll find is in charts is that you can have conjunctions. For example, when we just had our solar, or rather lunar eclipse and that full moon, that's what happens when there's an opposition between the sun and the moon. And so that particular aspect in astrology can also happen within, your personal planets. And so depending on the signs that each of these items are in, so your ascendant, your sun sign, and your moon sign, how those interplay with each other will also have very specific meanings that are very much tuned to you and your specific Starseed blueprint and mission here on this earth. So your ascendant or rising sign is the cusp of your first house and lines up the rest of the chart. Now, I know this can be entirely confusing, and I'm not going to pretend to say that I'm an expert on this particular aspect of astrology. I am much more invested in the stories of the planets and where they sit. But that being said, every sign has a domain, has a house that it rules over. And in the interest of this presentation, we're going to use Aries because I'm an Aries rising and Aries begins the chart anyways. And it's a good way to illustrate how that rising sign lines up the rest of your chart. And so if you take a look at this chart, as well as the charts that I have there in the presentation as a bit of visual aid, if you think about the cusp is where it's sitting between two signs. It's the beginning or end of the house. And so if you think about Aries, let's find Aries. Aries is right here. If let's say you were born at, and your rising sign was 0 degrees at Aries, so you're starting lined up completely with the way that the zodiac wheel itself lines up. It's really interesting because if you think about the hours in a day, the reason why your rising sign changes every 2 hours is because there are 24 hours in a day and there are 12 signs in the zodiac. And so just as there are 12, months in a year, the way the world works, the way the universe works. And so astrology is just a way of communicating and understanding the way that the universe works. It's really kind of cool. But anyways, back to what I was saying about lining things up in terms of the cusp and your housing system. Your first house is the house that rules self. Aries rules the first house. But for you, that may not be the case. And on top of that, you may have other planets, like in Freddie Mercury's case, where he had Venus in his first house because of the way that his housing system lined up based on your rising sign, right? So if it was in Aries, your first house is going to line up there, and then the rest of your housing system will line up according to the signs. And so your second house will be in Taurus, and all of that will just cascade down. Of course, it doesn't line up ever so perfectly like that. There's usually a bit of nuance and degrees and calculation. And so knowing your birth time and your location is important to derive that. And this is also why your chart is exactly yours and no one else has it. It is specific to you. Okay, Starseeds, thank you very much for joining me on this particular episode of Astrology Chats, where we talked about your rising or ascendant sign, which of course are part of one of the 3 main star signals in your Starseed Astrological Blueprint. If you would like to get your own astrological blueprint, please click the link in the description. I will include that in the follow-up notes, which will also include where you can get readings, as well as any upcoming presentations, events, and seminars that we have going on at sacredsomaAlchemy.com. Until next time, Starseeds, I hope that you have a beautiful evening wherever you are.